Hey, nerds. So, I'm going to start a new series here on Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments by Kierkegaard. Of course, very famous philosopher in the realm of religion. And it has that unbelievably pedantic title, of course, that philosophers do. And so it's actually a follow-up to his book with just a shorter title, although I'm sure the full title is longer too, called Philosophical Fragments. And then actually the full title, as the author usually reveals in the actual book itself when you open it up, is Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments, a mimical pathetical dialectical compilation, an existential contribution. Yeah. Remember how I always talk about the fact that the vast majority of philosophers, other than most Stoics, are phenomenally pedantic, obtuse, and verbose, like some more than others, like Foucault, who I'm a big fan of course. And obviously, of course, for those who don't know, he was Kierkegaard was a theologian in the 19th century, religious author, philosopher, poet, and he was considered like one of the fathers of existentialism. And remember, we've talked about Nietzsche many times before, and of course, he is one of the most famous existentialists, and a lot of people know about Nietzsche. He famously went crazy and tried to prevent I think it was a cow a horse from getting murdered, and he ended up in a mental institution. And his sister was a Nazi supporter. She uh she basically edited his final work, The Will to Power, to make it sound more sympathetic to Hitler, and then Hitler used it in his speeches. I just think Nietzsche had an interesting life. But so anyway, and existentialism is this idea, kind of in terms of truth and immorality, really, that that we define our own moral compass in life. We decide what life is all about to us. We choose our own meaning in life. There is no objective meaning in life, so we choose it. And similarly, I don't think it's an existentialist thing particularly, but Kierkegaard ties his existentialism to the idea of objective truth and the idea of God objectively existing in Christianity. So in philosophical fragments, that is like one of his main magnum opus books. He talks about, like I said, religion, truth, existentialism, criticizes Hegel, who I've, of course, many times before mentioned. He's one of the most famous German idealists, and he had a lot of really interesting ideas about religion and truth and reality, metaphysics, etc., phenomenology, etc. And so and there are lots of valid criticisms of Hegel. He has lots of fascinating opinions I've gone over a million times before in relation to various philosophers' thoughts on his thoughts, like Richard Rorty, pragmatist; Gianni Vattimo, Catholic; and of course my favorite Hegelian / Lacanian / Marxist philosopher, because he's the only one I know of, Slavoj Žižek, who calls himself a Hegelian, obviously, but also obviously is highly critical of Hegel. But anyway, with all of that preamble in mind here, I'll get into the relevant paragraph in this ridiculously pedantic and obtusely named book by Kierkegaard. Okay, so the objective issue of the truth of Christianity. And I looked up like basically how Kierkegaard thinks about this, and that's why it's important to do that, right? Because I felt like I understand what he's talking about now, because I know how to read the works of philosophers in terms of the way they write and what they actually mean. And I looked up other philosophers' interpretations and explanations, and that's really important to do, because this paragraph makes it sound like he is saying that Christianity is objectively true. But if you actually look into his views, he was actually highly critical of objective truth. So with that in mind, it really helps you understand the true meaning of what he's communicating in this paragraph. So anyway, the objective issue of the truth of Christianity. Objectively viewed, Christianity is res in facto posita, given fact. So we can say that it's an a priori truth, one that is just assumed to be true without needing to be proved. Like Kant would say that it's a synthetic a priori truth, a truth that doesn't need to be claimed, which to me makes it fundamentally flawed. Christianity is a res in facto posita, given fact, the truth of which is asked about in a purely objective way, because the modest subject is much. So you can see with that in mind, he's kind of like being sarcastic here. So you can, and mocking. So you can, with his true understanding of his opinion in mind, you can see the way he's actually writing this and the proper tone in which you should read it. Objectively viewed, Christianity is res in fact, he means like to the public. Res in facto posita, given fact, the truth of which is asked about in a purely objective way, because the modest subject is much too objective not to leave himself out, or with the res, without further ado. The subject is not allowed to leave himself out of looking Christianity in a purely objective way. So you see what he's getting at there, most likely, right? He's implying that if we look at Christianity as objectively true, we cannot escape looking at this supposedly objectively true observation and beliefs of Christianity from our own inherently biased subjective perspective, right? Okay, so the modest subject is much too objective not to leave himself out, or with the res, without further ado, to include himself as someone who has faith as a matter of course. So we all just are inherently meant to have faith and believe that Christianity is objectively true, which is a boring and dumb idea. And Kierkegaard was revolutionary in being one of the earliest philosophers and theologians to talk this way, like long before Nietzsche and Foucault and Zizek and plenty of other people with these challenging these ideas about Christianity and truth that challenge traditional narratives. Okay, so if we're talking about the modest individual, so from an existentialist perspective, it's almost impossible to that way to avoid your own biased perspective if you're coming to the conclusion that Christianity is objectively true. Okay, and Kierkegaard himself was a Christian. He just didn't believe in the objectively true version of Christianity, and we'll get to what his alternative was. Okay, so thus, objectively understood, truth can signify 1, historical truth, 2, philosophical truth. So I thought he was saying that at first that by objective truth he means historical truth and philosophical truth broken up into that. But if you actually understand what he's doing in terms of applying existentialism to truth, and you know that he's actually heavily critical of the idea of objective truth, he doesn't directly say it here, but basically he's criticizing the idea of objective truth because he's saying there are actually different kinds of truth, which is what post-structuralists actually say, like Foucault and Derrida, contrary to what pseudo-intellectual crackpots like Jordan Peterson say. They thought that there are different kinds of truth. They didn't believe that everything is all relative and nothing is true. There can be religious truths and scientific truths. Jordan Peterson himself is a postmodernist on truth. But anyway, so Kierkegaard is saying that there can be historical truth and philosophical truth, and he defines how these are different. Viewed as historical truth, the truth must be established by a critical consideration of the various reports. In short, in the same way as historical truth is ordinarily established. So you talk about the relevant factors in terms of the historical context at the time, in terms of historical truth. So we can say, so this is always true in terms of what we're talking about in history. Now you got to be careful and not say that this observation is objectively true, but it seems to definitely be the case that that the truth is always historically relevant or historically contingent. There are always a whole bunch of complex and endlessly changing and contradictory complex factors involved with every moment in reality in terms of everything we do, right? So that's historical truth. So every truth should be applied to its proper historical context. Okay, so and in the same way as historical truth is ordinarily established, in the case of philosophical truth, the inquiry turns on the relation of a doctrine, historically given and verified, to eternal truth. So in terms of philosophy, again, what you can say he's getting at here is in terms of the way society viewed it at the time in history in which he was criticizing the idea of objective truth. The relation, so you're talking about philosophical truth in terms of Christianity is truth in the relation of a doctrine historically given and verified to the eternal truth. So you can say that people who believe that Christianity is objectively true say it's both historically true and philosophically true, which makes it eternally true. But he's saying that you can see, he's not directly saying it here, but you can see, given what he believes, that what he's implying here is that you can say Christianity is historically true, but if if a truth is historically contingent, then it's not eternally true, because the historically relevant factors are endlessly changing, right? So the historical factors are going to change that eternal nature if we're talking about historical truth being contingent and related to history specifically, obviously, right? So if we're talking about philosophical truth, specifically in relation to society at the time, use this argument to argue that Christianity is objectively true, people would say that it's eternally true that the doctrine of Christianity is philosophically true. So then, to the people in the society where Kierkegaard lived at the time, and I got to double check this. He was Danish. Yeah, I thought he was Danish or Dutch, but yeah. So you could say that the people at the time where Kierkegaard lived in this particular period of history, his theory is that people saw Christianity as objectively true because they saw it as historically true at that period of time, and also philosophically true. So since it's philosophically true and historically true, it means it's historically true, but it's also eternally true to those people because the doctrine is philosophically true. And apparently the doctrine is philosophically always eternally true, regardless of the moment in history. And you can see how that contradicts with the idea of changing factors in terms of history, right? If something is eternally true, then what's the point of even distinguishing between historical truth and eternal truth? Because all of these, are these eternal truths going to be transcendent and outside of reality? Is that why? Is that God is transcendent and outside of reality? Some people say that, but they don't really get into that, and he's not really getting into that, at least in this section of the book. So it's interesting because if you look into Kierkegaard's specific view on truth, the way that he applies his existentialism to this is that instead of saying that Christianity, he's saying that, which again, this is revolutionary for the time. He's saying that Christianity is not objectively true, and we should view, he was still a Christian. He wasn't an atheist, so it wasn't that revolutionary at all for now. But for that period of history, he was revolutionary in basically claiming that through the perspective of existentialism, we should just define what is true about Christianity according to what we believe to be true in our heart and our love for the common man in the way of Jesus, that sort of thing, right? Sounds like a way better way of viewing Christianity to me. I'm not a Christian or religious, but there are way better and more interesting versions of Christianity than the stupid, antiquated, traditionalist, bigoted bullshit that people like Jordan Peterson preach. Yeah, there's way more interesting theology out there. That's to me, that's the point of this. This is all about the Christian Kierkegaard crucifying the idea of objective truth and saying that instead we should use our existentialism to define what we believe to be religiously true for ourselves. And he doesn't say this, but you could connect it to what Richard Rorty and Gianni Vitimo say in their book, The Truth of Religion, just choose whatever you want to believe about God or religion, and let everyone else believe whatever the fuck they want to believe. Like, just, you don't have to do what Kierkegaard advocates either, and be an existentialist Christian and be like, this is what I believe is true in Christianity, treating your common man with the common good and going out in the world with love in your heart. That sounds way better to me than just thinking Christianity is objectively true. So yeah, anyway, as usual, I think it's really interesting when a religious person and Christian person who, this was like during the Enlightenment, when like rationalism in science was really big, and Christians, like, society was becoming more secularized, as Nietzsche famously talks about, right? But it's also the case that due to the Enlightenment, the religious people were applying rationalist arguments to religion, like religious apologists, of course, not more secular people. They wanted to try to be more rationalistic, some of them. So that's why I think it's really interesting that this section of the book is all about Kierkegaard, the Christian, just completely crucifying the idea of objective truth. And I think if you connect that to Richard Rorty, it's really interesting, the perspective that just, no, Christianity is not objectively true. Choose to believe whatever the fuck about it you want to believe, and leave every